Right, okay, another knowledge video. I've already done the whole of medicine, but as you may recall, part of the medicine exam is the Western Front. So today we're going to talk about the World War One section. So before we even begin, little quick reminder, this course is all about the British sector. So we care about British soldiers only on the Western Front. That is France and Belgium. And it's about the environment. So it is all about the conditions, the terrain, the weather. It's all about the Western Front. Because this is a source part, you only need to know features and a source question. So basically what you need is very little amounts of knowledge about everything. So hopefully this video makes it absolutely perfect, because I'm going to go through the whole specification and just give you a little bit about everything. So you do not need to know a great deal. For example, you don't need 10 facts about the Somme. You just need a few about each one. So we'll start with the Battle of Ypres. There are 3 of them, first of all, to know, and they are in Belgium. It is the only battle that you must know is in Belgium. The first one is in 1914. Because of that, that means conditions are really bad, because it's right at the start of the war. So the trenches are very recently built, so there is a lot of trench foot. Because the conditions are so bad, the trenches are very new, it's very early. So you must, if you get a source on 1914 Ypres, think about it being a very new sort of battle, I guess, because it's right at the start of the war. Second one is in 1915. And this one is famous for the use of chlorine gas by the Germans, the first time gas was ever used. And the final one, 1917, this one is famous for being extremely wet. There was a huge amount of rain, which means that we saw trench foot again, even though it's unusual for this stage of the war. Trenches were very waterlogged, very muddy. So think about that kind of thing. And mustard gas was also used, but we'll get to that later. The main battle that many of you know is the Somme, which was in 1916, famous for having the worst day in British history. So July the 1st, and all of these 3 are in France, by the way. The only one that's not is Ypres. So on day 1, there was 60,000 casualties. And in total, there was 400,000. And remember, we're talking about British Army only here. So 60,000 on day 1, total 400,000. So if you get a source talking about the Somme, the medical staff are probably going to be overworked, very busy, not enough beds, examples. They also use tanks the first ever time, but not many. They use 49 tanks, but it is the first time tanks are used, the Battle of the Somme. Then we get to Arras. All you really need to know for Arras is that it's very chalky ground. And because it's very chalky ground, they can build an underground hospital. So you need to know about the underground hospital. This had beds. I think it had space for about 700 beds. There was electricity. They had a water supply. It didn't last very long, but if you get a source again in Arras, they may have been treated in the underground hospital. And last but not least, we need to know about Cambrai. Cambrai is famous because it's the first time the British Army used a huge amount of tanks. They used 476 tanks. They also had a lot of mobile X-ray. I say a few, but they were able to use mobile X-rays at Cambrai as well by the first time. So if there's a question or a source on the battles, just make sure you've got a couple of facts up your sleeves about each battle, so you know sort of when it was. I should have mentioned Cambrai is towards the end of 1917, by the way, and Arras is also in 1917. Right, now we'll get onto the trench system. Many of you know about the trench system already, so I don't know if I've got a separate one on trenches, actually, so let me double check. No, I don't. So I'll do it all here. So first of all, you've got to know about trenches in general. So if you get a question about a trench in general, just like a generic trench, like standard design, they are always built in zigzags. So bombs cannot explode and kill people all the way up the line. They always have things like a fire step and a duck board to avoid waterlogged conditions. If you are defending, you will have barbed wire. But if you're going over the top, you obviously will not. And they are always obviously man-made, about 2 to 3 meters deep height-wise. Obviously, they can't be too small or your head will be poking out. They can't be too tall or you won't be able to climb over the top. They will also have dugouts for you to sleep in, for you to hide if you are being attacked. Now, the most important thing is the organization of the trench system. So many of you hopefully remember this. There are 3 lines. The first one is the front line because that's the closest to the enemy. Then you have a support, and then you have a reserve. In terms of time you would spend in each one, you would spend about 15% of the time in a frontline trench, about 10% in the time of a support trench, and about 30% of the time in the reserve trench. 45% you wouldn't be in the trenches at all. Frontline trench is going to be the least safe because it's the closest to the enemy, therefore the worst condition. The job of a support trench was to reinforce or back up the front. If the front gets in trouble, you can send troops to support it, hence why it's called a support trench. And once again, if it goes really badly, you can therefore use the reserve trench to reinforce the support. But soldiers can also sort of backtrack, so they can retreat as well into each one. Obviously, the reserve is going to be in the best condition because it's the furthest away. So if you get a source and it's talking about really bad war conditions, it's probably going to be a frontline or support. If they're talking about conditions being quite good, they could be in a reserve. The other one you need to be aware of is there is a communication trench that links each trench together. That's what it means by the trench system. Read the question very carefully. Does it talk about an individual trench? Like, is it a feature of a trench in general, like zigzags or fire step? If it's a feature of a type of trench, make sure you talk about the specific trench. 15%, 10%, worst condition, best condition. Don't just say they have 2 to 3 meters deep, because that won't count, because that's just a generic trench. All right. So make sure you know the difference between, read the question carefully, a generic trench and the trench systems. Right, moving on. The other thing they want to talk about is about communication, transport, terrain. So the terrain is, because of artillery, there is obviously a lot of shell holes. Because of the Western Front being fought in for so long, the conditions are very bad, often very wet, often very waterlogged. This means that it's very difficult to treat people close to the front because the conditions are so bad. For transport, it's a real issue. So it's very difficult to use trains or cars or ambulances, vehicles, whatever you want to call them, close to the front line, because the train lines can get destroyed, the mud can cause it. So they have a real problem, which is why they have to rely on stretcher bearers. So the two go hand in hand. Because the terrain is so bad, because of the bombing, because of the weather, the artillery fire, etc., etc. What that means is the shell holes, mud craters, whatever you want to call them, it makes it really difficult to actually transport troops. And this, unfortunately, increases the death rate because it's hard to evacuate or move the wounded. Right, now we're getting on to the second part, which is conditions. They're very, very specific about this, so take this part very seriously. I'm actually going to start with ill health. When they say ill health, they mean illness, or ill health is the word they use. And they specifically say arising from the trench environment, meaning the environment that is around you. And there are only three on the course. First one is trench fever. Second one is trench foot. And the third one is what they call NYD.N, which stands for not yet diagnosed .nervous, which we know today as PTSD. They sometimes called it shell shock. So trench fever is classic fever symptoms: headaches, shivering, shaking, that kind of thing. Think of a bad fever. It's caused by lice that are in the rats, and therefore to treat it, they would take baths, clean their clothes, use a gel on their clothes. So bath houses would be used. I'll try and give you like a good fact to remember for each one. So trench fever was a problem even at the end of the war, because, for example, last 2 years of the war, 15% of men still caught trench fever. So it's classic fever symptoms. Trench foot, you know what it is. It's when your foot basically becomes moldy. It's caused by the wet conditions. It is a far bigger issue at the start of the war. It's not really a big issue until the end in 1917. Reason being that it's very easy to prevent once you know what causes it. So the wet conditions, the waterlogged trenches, in order to prevent it, they would use whale oil. Sounds weird, I know. And change their socks twice a day. When you do that, it's actually quite easy to prevent trench foot. So it's caused by the wet, waterlogged conditions when your foot is literally just sitting in it or standing in it for too long, and your foot almost becomes like moldy, I guess, for want of a better word. And once you get trench foot, the only way out is amputation. If you get it, you require amputation and you won't be able to fight anymore. So it's very severe. MYD.N is basically they don't understand what mental health is. They don't understand what shell shock is. So it's obviously caused by things like fear of death. The word shell shock comes from the constant shelling, hence the term shell shock. There's not really treatment or prevention except rest. So they give a lot of rest, go home, speak to your friends, speak to your family. Really good statistic to remember for an exam is in 1916, at the end, there were the most cases of shell shock ever. There was 16,000 cases. And if you figured out why, think back to the previous page, that was after the Battle of the Somme. So there was a huge amount of casualties. Day one would have been very stressful. So there'll be a high amount of shell shock after the Somme. So that's a really good stat to remember. Right, in terms of conditions requiring medical treatment, this is quite a tricky one. So you essentially need to know about the difficulties in treating, and we'll probably get into this more later on when we talk about wounds and rifles on the next page. I'm actually just checking whether this is... No, it's not. So it's not new treatment. So basically, this is talking just about like war wounds. So this means like your injuries. There's different kinds of issues that require treatment. Could be a problem with ill health. Could be a war wound. Could be a gun shot by a rifle, by a shell, that kind of thing. So we'll get into this more on the next page because... you'll notice they want you to know about the difference between the wounds. So basically, you need to know a little bit about the nature of the wounds. So explosives refers to either artillery, which is the most common form of injury because you get bombed a lot over the top of the trenches, so high explosive shells. So make sure you know about that. Rifle and machine gun are different. So the machine gun is the most deadly defensive weapon. It can fire 600 bullets a minute. But many of you may know this already. Rifles have bigger and sharper bullets. So they might fire less frequently, but their bullets will cause less damage. Shrapnel is like a combination of artillery and explosive. So shrapnel is artillery that explodes midair. Causes a lot of facial injuries because it could explode like near to the ground and then shoot upwards. And increased number of head injuries is a slightly weird thing to say. But the reason why is because the start of the war, they did not have helmets. They just wore like flat caps. So at the start, there were no helmets. They started to be distributed in 1915. And I think the end of 1915, they all had steel helmets. But actually, at the start of the war, head injuries was a real issue because of the artillery, because of the explosive shells. So all of these injuries, unfortunately, can require amputation, can cause infection, etc., etc. Then we move on to a big topic, very common exam question, which is gas attacks. So gas attacks are not that deadly. There are 6,000 total deaths by gas in the British Army. And in fact, that's only about 5% of the total deaths. But they are very highly feared because it's a horrible way to go. Although the deaths aren't that high, they are very, very highly feared. And there are 3 gases. The first one is chlorine gas, first used in 1915, as we mentioned at the Second Battle of Ypres. This can cause you to suffocate, but it's mainly an irritant. Think of chlorine. What does it do? It irritates your eyes, it can irritate your nose. So it irritates, it's annoying. And again, it's a green, yellow color. So that's the first gas. The second one is the most deadly. And again, you need to know this to analyze sources. Phosphine is used at the end of 1915, and it is the most deadly. 85% of gas deaths are by phosphine. One of the reasons why is it is colorless. Now you can smell it, but you can't see it early on, so it can affect people earlier on. And what it does is it fills your lungs with fluid, and over the next, say, 2 days or 48 hours, it will kill you by suffocation. Not very nice. And then last but not least, we have mustard. Mustard is used in 1917. It is odorless, so you can't smell it, and it's less likely to kill, but more likely to damage. So it causes temporary blindness, can cause bloodshot eyes, and also a lot of blistering. So at the very start, they don't have gas masks. So no gas masks in 1914. When chlorine is first used, there are no gas masks. They have to use things like a handkerchief or urine tied around their face, a bandage tied around their face. Then by 1915, after chlorine, and definitely by 1916, all soldiers have gas masks. So it does become easier to prevent. If you do get gassed, you treat it by sort of cleaning the skin, or you are given oxygen if you are unlucky enough to be gassed. But to be fair, it is quite easy to prevent, which is why there's only 6,000 total deaths. But at the start, it is worse, and phosphine is the most deadly. So try and remember a specific effect of each one. And if you do that, if you get a source that talks about blindness in 1917, you know it's mustard. So that's where you use your own knowledge to back up the source. Right. Not too much more to go now. It's a relatively short course. The RAMC, all this means is medical officers who work for the army. That's all RAMC means. So it basically means surgeons, doctors, etc., but they work for the army. They've changed the course. This used to be called FANY, which probably they changed it because of how it sounds. So now they just call it nurses. And think of the role that nurses do. They do a lot of different jobs. They are close to the front. They will work sort of bandaging, but also assisting in casualty clearing stations close to the front with gas attacks, etc. So just make sure you know that nurses are not just in hospitals, they are close to the front. And RAMC just means like surgeons, anyone, literally anyone, organised medical care. They treat soldiers close to the front, that kind of thing. Just means doctors who work for them. So there's not much to know about them. You might want to research personnel so you know, like if it mentions RAMC surgeon, just means a surgeon who works for the military. Right, final big topic is the chain of evacuation. So what this means is there is a wounded soldier, and what you have to do is get him treated ASAP, because the difference between life and death is going to be the speed in which you treat him. We've already mentioned transport a little bit, but I will go into very, very basic detail of this. The evacuation is like a triage system, meaning the more severe, the quicker hopefully you get seen and the further you get sent back. So step one of the evacuation route is the RAP, the Regimental Aid Post, okay? Should have actually written Regimental Aid Post, but it's there. The Regimental Aid Post will have only one medical officer, so one member of the RAMC. They will do very basic things like dressing up a wound, and basically they are literally a post in the ground, hence why it's called post. They are right by the front. They may even be in a trench. Very minor treatment, bandages, that kind of stuff, and then go straight back out to fight. Once you get past the RAP, let's say you're a little bit more severe, you will go to a dressing station. This is still very, very close to the front line. It's about a quarter of a mile away. So it's a little bit further away. What they will do at a dressing station, though, is they will triage you here. So they will see how severe is your injury. Do you need to keep going back somewhere more severe, or can you stay close to the front? Again, very basic surgery, very basic treatment like bandages, wounds. Think very, very simple. If it is a more serious injury, then you will be sent to a CCS, a casualty clearing station. This is a bit more severe. So these are normally about 7 to 12 miles away. So they're still in France. They are still relatively close. They can handle about 1,000 patients, And they do have operating theatres. So they can do x-rays, they can do surgery, they can do blood transfusions, they can almost do anything a hospital can do. If, unfortunately, it's even worse, it's a really bad injury, you're not going to fight for a long, long time, you might want to be closer to home, they will send you to a base hospital. This could be on the coast of England or the coast of France, but it's normally quite near. These are obviously much further away. They can handle 2,500 patients, and they can do all the same things in terms of they also have an operating theatre. So the more severe your injury, the further you go back. Just remember like a fact about each one so you can talk about them a little bit. Then we'll talk about how they actually get to places. So before you get to the RAP and probably to a dressing station, it would be a stretcher bearer who takes you. It takes 4 men to carry one, not 2, like in films. It is 4, 1 in each corner. There are 16 stretcher bearers. So 16 stretcher bearers per battalion, which is 1,000 men. So 16 stretcher bearers per 1,000 men. So imagine the Battle of the Somme, when you've got like thousands of wounded in one day, you've only got 16 stretcher bearers per 1,000 to help. When you go to like a CCS or a base hospital, the guys are not going to walk 7 to 12 miles. So they will use ambulances, either horse or motor. The issue with these are they can't use them close to the front because, as we mentioned earlier on, the terrain, the conditions, etc., etc. So they have to be a bit further away. So quite a big topic, the evacuation route. Make sure you know RAP, dressing station, CCS, and base hospital. A lot of the sources will say they are at one of these places. So you need to know a little bit about them. If it's a serious injury, it will be these 2. If it's a minor wound, it will be these 2. But remember, before they can send you away, they got to triage it, which means the more severe injuries will go first. Right, last but not least, this is probably the hardest page, so we should aim for about 25 minutes, which is good. Right, this is the hardest bit, so pay quite close attention because these are the bits you can get wrong. So firstly, this is really difficult. New techniques in the treatment of wounds and infection. They are talking about a method called the Carroll-Dakin method. Carroll-Dakin was 2 people, one named Carroll, one named Dakin, and they came up with a method that would help prevent infection. One of them was a surgeon, one of them was a pharmacist, and there was like a combination of the 2 of them that came up with this idea. So the Carroll-Dakin method is quite tricky. Essentially, firstly, it's a way of treating, and then it's a way of using a solution to stop infection. So the first thing they do is they do quite a deep surgery around, let's say, a bullet wound, and they cut dead skin or dead tissue around it. Then what they do is they insert a tube directly into the wound, and that wound then gets a solution that is called the Carroll-Dakin solution. It was made by one of them. That solution helps prevent infection. They come up with this in 1916, which means infection is a real problem at the start of the war. That's all you need to know for Carroll-Dakin. Solution into the wound, stop infection. Thomas Splint, many of you remember, 1916 is invented. When you are shot in the femur and you break your femur, so a broken femur, you had an 80% chance of dying at the start of the war. And the reason why was because when you were being transported, so when you were in that stretcher, your leg was bouncing around all over the place, your bones would grind together, and it would cause a huge amount of blood loss. What the Thomas Splint does is it holds your leg in place during transport, stops your bones grinding together, stops the blood loss, and it reduced the death rate of a broken femur to 20%. So remember, Thomas Splint holds it in place, stops blood loss, stops bones grinding, used during transport to put your leg in a fixed, straight position, results in a 20% death. Mobile X-ray units are simply X-rays that are done in a vehicle. So it could be like an ambulance, a vehicle that has X-rays in it. There are only 6 of them in the British Army. So there are not many of them, but they're really useful because you don't have to be treated in a hospital. And what will they do? They will check for shrapnel, check the bullet location, etc., etc. So mobile X-ray units. I think they were not used until the end of the war. So they weren't used until the very end. It took a while for the technology to work. In total, as I mentioned, there were 6 only. Blood bank in Cambrai. So you need to know about blood transfusions. At the start of the war, they could not store blood. Now, what this means is, because they couldn't store blood, if you wanted to give blood to somebody, let's say you're a blood donor, you had to actually be physically there. Literally take your blood, give it to someone, the donor has to be present. However, during the war, they realized that if you add sodium citrate, therefore, you can now store blood. This means when the donor gives blood, you can then store it, put it in a blood bank or a blood depot, essentially a tube, and give it to someone on the Western Front. So the donor does not have to be present. It can be stored. And the first time they used like a big blood bank, like with a lot of blood to treat soldiers, was the Battle of Cambrai in 1917. So if you get a question on Cambrai and talk about blood transfusions, just mention it was the first time they used a blood bank. So they already knew blood groups, they did know blood types, but they didn't know how to store it. Thought we were there, but I lied. Sorry. Very, very nearly there. This is literally very easy. So we've done infection. To be fair, this is actually repeating what we've already said. We've mentioned infection. We've mentioned X-rays done for shrapnel, bullet wounds and stuff. Blood transfusion, developments and storage of blood we have done. The only treatment that we didn't mention, which I actually didn't realize it wasn't on the specification, which I didn't realize, so I'll mention it here. I'm surprised. I thought it would be, is plastic surgery and brain surgery. So plastic surgery becomes a lot more common during the war, not surprising, obviously, where people need to have it. They do 11,000 operations during the war. The most famous methods is the Harold Gillies method. He comes up with this, hence why it's called Harold Gillies, which is a skin graft, which is where you take skin from a part of your body. And the most famous hospital, the first ever hospital with a specialist unit, was Queen Mary's, round the corner in Sidcup. Easy to remember. Other surgery you got to know about is brain, and thinking about it, when it says surgery, it probably means plastic and brain, so it is on the course. It just doesn't explicitly say it. For brain surgery, they use a local anaesthetic. It's local because you can't be put to sleep like a general anaesthetic. You need to be awake. And then they use a magnet, sounds weird, in order to remove fragments from your brain. Scary, but it does work. So if you get a question on that, just mention local anaesthetic, magnets. Done X-rays, done surgery, done blood transfusions, mentioned donor present, done all of this. Last thing to mention is the type of infection you can get. There are 2 types of infection in the soil, tetanus, and which for some reason I can't spell, and gas gangrene. Gas gangrene is nothing to do with gas. It's because when you've got it, you get like a little boil or whatever. It looks like gas. So both of these were infections in the soil, meaning the Western Front soil. I don't know why, but you would get these 2 infections. Good news, tetanus can be treated. By late 1914, they had a tetanus jab, like a vaccine, stops you getting it. Bad news, they couldn't really ever deal with gas gangrene. So if you were infected with gas gangrene, it could result in amputation, it could result in death. So gas gangrene is the harder to deal with. So if you see a soldier dying of infection or struggling with infection, they've probably got gas gangrene. Right, I'm done. I actually thought I'd be quicker than half an hour. Shows you how much there is. Last thing I just wanted to mention was this whole course is a source question. It's a source paper. So remember, there is a horrible exam question on 2B where you have to choose your own source. When we say choose your own source, that means we don't mean Google the internet, a real document at the time. So it means choose a year of a source, choose a place of the source, and either choose a big national source, like an army record of death, like a newspaper to tell you what happened in a specific battle, like a government report, like a medical article from a doctor, from a surgeon who has written an actual article to treat others, or a more local source. So a personal account, a diary of a soldier. Let's say you're investigating trench foot. I want to read from a diary of a soldier who had it. A local photo of a battle scene, so you might see the conditions. A local hospital record or local army statistics. So learn the names of the sources as well. And when you get that horrible exam question that says, what type of source would you use? Choose one of these, okay? Don't actually write personal account, but say an account from a diary of a soldier, a diary of a nurse. These are actually on the course, these 8. So learn the 8 sources, and then you can't go wrong. Right, that is all of medicine done. Enjoy.